hour into the central Birmingham area. It's looking to therefore for journey time improvements, some capacity increases, and it's also hoping to therefore link up with the HS2 programme of work, so the High Speed 2 programme of works, which has got various stops within Birmingham itself as well. So as a programme, Midland Rail Hub, it's been broken up into, I guess, 9 really key interventions that are listed there. So Bordersleigh to Moore Street. So these are different areas within the southwest area, the central area of Birmingham, and also the eastern parts, the East Midlands side of things as well. And there's 2 system area 1 and 2 where there's some large resignaling and interlocking renewals that are going to be going across the entirety of the programme as well. So 9 key interventions. In terms of where we get involved, so we started to get involved in a stage of the programme for Network Rail Talk, which is called ES3. So kind of like option selection design activities. So looking at outline business case. And the nice thing is that the Network Rail team, prior to that, even during ES1 and ES2, so even at conceptual type strategic business case timelines, they'd already started to implement safety assurance activities into the programme as well. And that doesn't happen too often, even on some of the large programmes. So it's been really good that there's been some key activities that have been started early. So in terms of some of the technical works that they're going to be doing, so there is a diagram on the screen there. So this was a key diagram that was used to help just provide a bit of an oversight as to the works that are being undertaken. This got included in some of our key documents that we'll talk about later. So we've got the Southwest Corridor, we've got Central Corridor, and we've got the East Midlands Corridor. So some of the key activities that are going to be undertaken will be construction of brand new lines. There's going to be a lot of alterations to existing lines, some station changes. So some of those will be where we introduce new platforms. We reintroduce existing platforms into service, some platforms that haven't been used for quite a long time. There'll be some new platforms built at some stations. There's going to be some platform lengthening at stations. And there's going to be a whole new set of signalling and train control systems in various parts of the project as well, where they're still using mechanical interlocking technology as well. So really large and complex infrastructure upgrade program. At the moment, if I just actually go back to this slide, so at the moment, the activity stops at the end of option selection, so at the ES3, and at the moment there's a large tender evaluation exercise going on, which will then see the rest of those project stages be introduced all the way through to completion. So last I heard, I think it was about £1.5 billion worth of work. So what's that in Canadian money? So I guess about $2.8 billion worth of work that's going to be sort of undertaken over the next, I think it's about the next 8 or so years. So that's just a little bit about setting the scene for what the programme's about. Now, some of you, whether or not you're in the UK or in Canada, so CSM, CMREA, a lot of you would be very familiar with the diagram that's on the right-hand side. So that's the risk management process that's come from the Common Safety Method for Risk Evaluation and Assessment Regulations. And the diagram that we've got more towards the centre of the screen, that's a diagram that's come out of a Network Rail System Review Panel standard. So in the UK, we can have projects that are either deemed to be non-significant projects, so on the left-hand side, significant projects, which is the funnel down the middle, or projects which are interoperable, so something which is CSM significant and also interoperable. It also therefore needs to meet other UK regulations as well. So not just considering the safety aspect of it. So during the early stages of the project, one of the first things that was looked at during the early stages was to understand, is the program of works deemed significant, and is it deemed interoperable? So those two sort of blue boxes outlining those sections of the various processes. And an early stage system definition document and other information was submitted to MRAP. So that is the Network Rail Assurance Panel. So they're an independent panel within Network Rail that helps judge whether or not projects are deemed CSM, like safety significant, and whether or not they also require authorization under another legal framework. So this information got submitted by the Network Rail team to MRAP, and MRAP came back and ratified the decision and said, yes, you are CSM significant, and it also confirmed that they're going to have to seek an authorization under the RIR, which is the Railway Interoperability Regulations. Again, for those of you in Canada, doesn't really apply, but we'll be touching upon some of that as well. So it's just another set of really key assurance activities. And those decisions, as you can imagine from what I hopefully covered off and addressed okay in the last couple of slides, are really made because there's brand new infrastructure and there's going to be very significant major upgrades, renewal activities as well that are being done. So because of those decisions, that means therefore that from a CSM perspective on the diagram on the right, so from a safety assurance perspective, we had to follow the whole rest of the process, and also therefore encompass that independent assessment bar on the left-hand side. So that pink bar on the left-hand side. If the project had been non-CSM significant, and we wouldn't have needed to do that independent assessment activity, so the blue box would have been a bit tighter. And then from the diagram in the middle, we're following the right-hand branch, which is for interoperable projects. So that governs some other sort of more detailed safety assurance activities and bodies that we need to involve, but also it involves some other external bodies that we need to satisfy from an interoperability directive perspective. And that diagram in the middle also does keep going a bit further on down to the end of the program. But I wanted to try and get it onto the screen so it was legible. So now that we know which routes that we need to follow, that we need to bring on independent bodies into the mix, we've resolved that nice and early in the program. We then needed to go about sort of preparing our key project documentation. So from the diagram in the middle, I'll come back to the bit a bit later where it talks about project appoints, ASBO, NOBO, DEBO. We'll come on to that a little bit later. So some of the first key documents that we therefore produced was system definition. So we took the version that was initially submitted to MRAP during the strategic outline business case, so ES2. So we took that and we started to refine that into some more detail. As things have progressed, we got a little bit more detail on the options that could be selected. And that was an activity that was led by the Network Rail project team. And it contained all of the relevant content requirements as you'd expect that a system definition should contain. So that information that we've got bulleted on the left-hand side. And there are some very common elements of that program-wide system definition. So physical functional interfaces, the environment, assumptions, a lot of that was very common across all of the interventions. So it was only really bullets 2 and 3 where they went into a lot more detail around this is what the Snow Hill intervention is like. This is what the Bordersley to Moore Street intervention contains. So it was a program-wide system definition that then went into a bit more detail where it needed to for each of those 9 interventions. The idea being that when we then start to get into ES4, which is kind of like single option selection, and then we start moving on into detailed design, construction, testing, commissioning, etc. Each of those interventions will then generate its own individual system definition document as well. just so that we can start getting into a lot more of the detail for each of those interventions that we would that we would need to. And because each of those interventions are going to be moving along at different paces, as well as these projects progress at different stages, it's going to be a lot easier to have their own standalone documentation, and we're not constantly updating this program-wide system definition as we go through the process. It's something that was done on other projects in the UK, Great Western Electrification, that again I know a few people worked on here as well. So again, ideas came from good places, program-wide documentation, and then as we move on into later stages, we have sort of standalone intervention system definitions as well. And we're doing that as well pretty much with the other key documents. So program authorization strategy, safety plan, following the same sort of process with that. From a program authorization strategy perspective, so this is very much focusing on compliance to something we have over here called the interoperability regulations. And essentially that's that's a set of technical requirements that we have to make sure that all of the systems are interfacing correctly as railways go across country borders. Still applicable in the UK even after we exited Europe. Brexit, still applicable to us. So we have to prepare this program authorization strategy and then later on develop how capture how we've met some of these technical requirements as we move through the life cycle of the project. So whilst on that diagram, you can see there that it's something that should be produced quite early. Again, it's not too often that we've seen it produced as early as like option selection phase. So we've tried to make sure that we've got as much detail in there as we can early on, so that the later sort of stages of the program are fully aware as to what's coming. So we've already defined in there what the authorization boundaries are. We've talked about the applicability of each national technical specification notice. So essentially they are technical requirements against different subsystems. So infrastructure, people with reduced mobility, energy. Probably should have expanded out some of these acronyms, so apologies if some of you haven't heard some of these terms before. So we've defined the applicability of the technical requirements against each of these standards, against each of the interventions. We've talked about what modules for authorization assessment are going to be undertaken by the independent bodies. There's lots of different types of modules that you could be authorized against, depending on your type of project. Interoperability constituents are essentially products and subsystems that need to meet certain interoperability criteria for them to be used as part of a project. So it's kind of like a product acceptance process, but with some additional requirements tagged onto it as well. Excuse me. So we've started to pick out already those interoperability constituents that where we would need to get certain types of certification, certain types of approval that they meet these extra criteria. So again, we can start building that into the program early on and hopefully not be left with any last minute surprises. As we've built the system, we realise we've not used certain subsystems that maybe we should have done that meet certain criteria. We've talked about some derogations that need to be developed. So even early on, even this early in the program, we're aware that there will be certain requirements that we can't meet due to certain constraints already within the existing infrastructure. So we started to outline that so that the independent bodies are already aware of that and we can follow that derogations process. The command and control signaling. So the signaling interventions aren't mentioned here, essentially because although we're introducing computer-based interlocking into some of these areas, technically that doesn't fall under an interoperability sort of set of technical requirements. If it had been an ETCS, European Train Control System, then we would have needed to have thought about some other control command signaling requirements. In terms of the structure of the authorization, so that sort of authorization commissioning strategy, that is going to be developed as we move later on into the process. again, as we move on, we're going to want to look at these technical requirement specs again to make sure that what we've picked out now as being applicable are still applicable for these technical requirements as we move these interventions into later design phases. From a system safety plan perspective, so nothing here regarding the interoperability aspect of it. For some of you that have been on earlier webinars, we know that actually a safety plan isn't technically brought up as a term within the Common Safety Method regulations. It's also not a term used in the Canadian method equivalent as well. But we always try and produce those system safety plans early on in the project process at the same sort of time that we produce our system definition as well. And again, very similar set of items that we would look to include in our system safety plan. So the one that we developed during ES3 pretty much talked about, well, no, it did talk about all of these items that we've got here. So defining the system, referring back out to our main system definition that we've covered earlier. We talked about safety roles and responsibilities on the project and all of the various interfacing parties that we need to think about so that we can make sure they're involved in that hazard identification and management piece as the program progresses. How we are applying specifically CSM and Network Rail standards to the project from a safety assurance perspective, how we're managing hazard records, safety approvals, acceptance, deliverables that we'd look to be producing now at ES3 and in the future stages of the project, and the timeline of activities from a early ES3 perspective. Again, as we move on into the later stages of the project, we'd be looking to have standalone safety plans for each of these interventions. Again, the program safety plan can contain all of the generic information that talks about the types of hazard management, hazard identification processes that will be deployed, how we're going to go about selecting risk acceptance principles. There's a lot of generic information that can stay within a program level document. And then each of those standalone intervention safety plans can go into the real detail as to what specific risk assessments we might need to do, the types of stakeholders that we need to invite into the discussions, and any other really technical discipline-led risk assessments, for example, to do with level crossings, grade crossings, that again we need to factor in to our safety assurance activities. So that's the idea moving forward. We're not technically involved in that yet, but again, the Network Rail program safety manager was accepting of that as an idea, so hopefully that will be the process that comes to pass. You know, having seen it on other large programs, it's worked, so hopefully that'll be the method taken forward. So we've set up all of our safety planning documents. We've defined our system in our system definition, so that's set the scope of that sort of bound the scope of our risk assessment activities. And now we're starting to dive into the hazard identification and management element of it. So again, for those of you that don't do this too often, as you can see from the sort of pink orange bar on the right hand side, there's lots of touch points with hazard management all the way through the CSM process. As you'd expect, we want to be identifying hazards early and demonstrating how we're going to be managing those and mitigating those all the way through the process. So we've captured all of that information in various hazard records that I'll talk about in a bit. But I just want to spend a little bit of time on this slide because this is, I think, where, you know, there are some activities done here that aren't always done on every project that goes through the CSM process, which is, I think, in part why, you know, some of this work was recommended to the Network Rail Investment Centre of Excellence. So as I mentioned earlier, Network Rail, they developed a lot of really good safety assurance documentation in the earlier phases of the program. So during the strategic outline business case activities, so sort of like even early on as concept. So they'd run some workshops initially. They'd generated some hazard records that focused on each of those key areas, those key regions, so Southwest, Central and East Midlands. So that was really good. So there's already some good things that we could start to look at and look to continue. I'm a big believer that we should not be starting any of these types of projects with blank pieces of paper. So there is lots of good stuff that was already done that we could sort of take forward to the next stages. So NRDD, so that is Network Rail Design and Delivery. So NRDD produced a number of concept reports for the different types of options that could be selected for each of these interventions moving forward. And as part of that activity, they'd also started to, at quite a high level, but nonetheless, they started to think about some of the hazards and some of the risks associated with some of those different options. Again, something that we don't always see an awful lot of in some of these early reports. So that was really good. And we were able to double check that some of those had been already captured in the earlier hazard records. So great stuff. Network Rail have also developed a series of generic hazard records. At the time that we were undertaking this activity, the main one that had been developed was for stations. And again, as I mentioned earlier on, with some of the works being undertaken, there was a lot of station type activities being undertaken. So again, we were able to look at the generic station hazard record to help feed that into the process as part of our option selection activities. And therefore, we also then ran a number of hazard identification workshops and then a number of refresh sessions where we would focus on not necessarily identifying new hazards, but just going through and making sure that as the design has been developed, that we're refreshing what's in the hazard record and making sure that things are still relevant to it. So to feed into that hazard workshop activity, we use a number of various sources. Again, because there's so much good stuff out there already, we don't want to go into these things cold. There's no point in doing that. It's a waste of time. So we looked at the RSSB safety risk model. So for those of you who are aware of it, it's got hundreds and hundreds of entries that talk about hazardous events and precursors. Lots and lots of hazard causes in there that we can use to help stimulate some of the conversations during hazard workshops. So many years ago, there had been various sort of research papers that had taken these models and they'd reduced it, I think, down to, I think it's 12 high-level RSSB hazards, but not so much on the precursor side of it. So whilst the hazards got discussed, some of that precursor information still sits within that safety risk model. This is our opinion of things. Again, there's lots of good Network Rail experienced people on the call. So we looked at each of these precursors and we were able to very quickly sift through for each of the interventions which of those we thought may or may not be relevant for each of the intervention workshops that we were going to be coming up with. So we were able to take some of that using our judgment. Some of those that we weren't sure about, we checked with the program safety manager before we went into the workshops, but we were able to use that to help stimulate these sorts of conversations. So for some of you that have chaired hazard workshops, that have attended hazard workshops, they can sometimes not be the most exciting of workshops to get involved in. They can be a little bit dry. So again, sometimes just things like this to act as prompts to help get the conversation going. We just found that worked really, really well. So as I say, we didn't want to discuss all like 1,500 odd entries in a workshop. That would just not be a good use of anyone's time, but we were able to use it to help narrow down and act as a bit of a checklist moving forward. We actively looked at previous rail accident investigation reports from the rail accident investigation branch, so RAAB. So they produce a number of accident and investigation reports. And there's various filters on the website where you can type in keywords and things like that. So again, we picked out some investigation reports that we thought would be worth discussing as part of some of these interventions. Not all of those reports were worth discussing every intervention because the scope was a bit different. But again, we were able to include some mini tables in the back of our workshops and use those as discussion points as well. Honestly, I think most of the ones that we picked out, I think we were able to justify why they might not have been applicable to a particular intervention, but there were certainly a few in there that we looked to capture as potential hazards moving forward for our intervention works. There's also a lot of really good checklists and guide words that are already out there. So we looked at using some hazard checklists as things were sort of starting to dry up in the workshop. So we'd use some of the previous hazard record information, the generic station hazard record. We used some of the RSSB safety risk model. Then we did a brainstorming activity using track diagrams, general arrangement drawings, signaling scheme plans, the usual sort of stuff that you would use in the workshop. But even then, after that, we would then look to use some hazard checklists. So that one's come from the IESM. There's some good checklists in there. We use some guide words. So some hazard guide words, again, you can just about make out on the bottom left-hand corner. Again, those guide words didn't really call up a whole load of other hazards that we hadn't thought about, but it did stimulate some conversation in other areas. And then as we started to move towards the sort of refresh activities as well, and we were starting to figure out how we were going to manage these hazards, we were then able to start using some other information, hazard analysis and safety requirements that have been generated in other standards. So this one's come from an automated urban guided transportation system. Nothing that we're doing on Midland Rail Hub is going to be automated, but there is some, again, quite high level generic hazards and safety requirements captured in that standard that, again, we're able to use as part of the conversation. Given that each of these interventions is going to later have a system definition, well, this is how it's all been set up for. Given they're all going to have their own intervention system definition, safety plans, we started early on to start generating a hazard record per intervention as well. So the early stage hazard record that was done at strategic business case, we started to split that up and put the entries into their relevant hazard records per intervention. And as we were starting to move through the progress, as some risk assessments were being produced regarding fire, platform train interface, we were able to take that information and start to insert that into the hazard record as well, to make sure that we're really not just using generic wording, but really capturing some of the specific issues that have been sort of identified as we were going through the process. So a whole load of desktop activities that we did, run some workshops for each of the interventions, excuse me. And then after that, when we're running some refresh workshops as well as design changes, making sure things are still relevant or not, making sure that what we hand over right at the end is really relevant to everyone. We then convene, again, some of you will recognise this, we then had to convene a number of other follow-up sessions with various individuals. So we made sure that we involved Network Rail project engineers and also contractor responsible engineers, so discipline subject matter experts from the design teams as well. So we spoke to them about what risk acceptance principle it is that we need to use to mitigate the hazardous events that have been identified. So we've got those, so codes of practice, similar reference system, explicit risk estimation. Which one of those or combination of did we think at this early stage did we need to think about? So where we had some of those derogations, we were already thinking that, okay, well, ideally, yes, code of practice, but we might have to go down that explicit risk estimation route. We generated a list of existing safety measures against all of these hazards that are already deployed on the railway. And we started to think about how they could be impacted by the new hazards, well, by these specific application hazards that we'd identified. Are they still valid as a safety measure, or actually are they no longer valid, or they need to be changed slightly? And then based on that risk acceptance principle existing safety measure discussion, we were then able to generate these high level safety requirements that again will need to be met. But at the particular stage that the work sort of came to a bit of a stop at option selection, we hadn't yet really gone into clause level to develop these safety requirements. So we hadn't really gone into the real detailed specifics at that time. But again, these sorts of safety requirements aren't generally generated at all until we start moving into single option selection. So the next phase really. So again, to get some safety requirements in at this sort of stage of the project, again, we're just hopefully getting everything on a really good foundation for as things move forward. And as you'd expect, a lot of these types of interventions have got similar hazards, so similar sort of safety measures. So again, something that was really important was just making sure that we had consistent wording across all of the intervention hazard records. So the ways that we look to mitigate one particular hazard in the Southwest region shouldn't really be an awful lot different to how we mitigate it in the East Midlands region, unless there's some real funny specific stuff going on there. We should be making sure that that information is consistent as we move along. At the end of this particular phase of the project, we developed a safety justification report. So the key part of this safety justification was to try and help just demonstrate that, yes, we're not going to have anything closed at this particular phase of the project. There's no way we can do. But what we're trying to justify here is that we're happy that we've started going down a good path of making sure that we've identified all of our reasonably foreseeable hazards. So I'm not going to go through each of these. Some of you may not have seen a safety justification report. Some of you have written really complex, detailed safety cases, but these are the key elements that we started to talk about in our safety justification at this early design phase. So we talked about project classification, so significance, interoperability, the assurance of the process, so the fact that we had gone to the Network Rail Assurance Panel at the beginning of the project to ratify the classification, but also after we had developed the system definition and the project program authorization strategy, we had taken those back to MRAP as well. There's a bit in there about system definition. So we did a safety justification per intervention as well. It's probably a point worth making. So, for example, this is the contents page from the Snow Hill one. So we gave a little bit of information about Snow Hill intervention in this safety justification, but the majority of that information we would point back to our system definition document. Roles and responsibilities, safety life cycle and scope. So we talked about all of the good stuff that had happened prior to this particular phase of the project. And then we talked about all of the desktop analysis activities, workshops, the fact that we'd started to have follow-up discussions to identify how we would mitigate them through various safety controls. And then we also talked about what we felt were going to be the next steps moving forward, because submitting a hazard record at this very early stage to an independent assessor, there's going to be a whole load of blanks still at this particular phase. So we wanted to recognise that in this safety justification report and talk about the processes that we believe needed to happen moving forward in the later project stages to address these gaps and manage things properly. So, mentioned earlier, the project was deemed CSM significant and also interoperable. So therefore, that meant that we would need to bring on independent assessors. So an assessment body against the CSM regulations. So in Canada, that's your equivalent of an independent safety assessor against CMREA. So we call it an assessment body over here. And then the terminology's changed slightly here from an interoperability perspective. We brought on an approved body and a designated body. So they would be the body that would do the independent assessment against the interoperability regulations and the various technical clauses, technical requirements that the projects needed to meet. So network certification body, so NCB, so they're one of the accredited independent bodies in the UK. There are others, so like in Canada as well, that you're accrediting independent safety assessors. So NCB are one of those that are accredited in the UK. So they were appointed as the assessment body, approved body, and designated body. Most of the work that they did in this particular phase with us was assessment body, so safety assurance type assessment activities. The demonstration of compliance to the interoperability requirements doesn't really kick in until we start getting really detailed design evidence against these technical clauses, and that's a few years away yet. But they did review the authorization strategy just to make sure there weren't any big sort of red flags that we had sort of missed. So they produced 2 independent assessment plans, so setting out their approach to conducting their sort of progressive assurance activities. There was only really 2 plans, one covering Southwest and Central and the other covering East Midlands. Essentially, the content was pretty much the same. I think it was just a phasing of activities because it didn't all happen at the same time. I think that was the only reason why there was 2 assessment plans in the end. So we were able to review that. We were able to understand how long they needed to review our documentation to enable them to conduct their activities. We had a lot of interaction with them, again, despite the early stages of the program. So we made sure that they were invited, and I think they came to pretty much all of our hazard identification workshops to sit there as an observer. We had regular progress review meetings with them, so at least once a month, essentially. And some of those might have just been a quick half an hour. How are you? Has anything really moved on since the last chat? But again, we were touching base with them really regularly. And as soon as some of our key documents were ready, we were sending them over to NCB for review as well. So if they had any big issues with anything, we were able to address that early on before it got to that final submission. So all of that activity was being done with us, Network Rail project team, to aid the assessment body in producing their safety assessment report, their SAR. So that is the main document that an assessment body or an independent safety assessor, if this was Canada, that's the key document that they produce. So they produced one that covered all 9 interventions, and there were sort of no major, no minor non-compliances, 14 recommendations, 25 observations. So split that across 9 interventions. It wasn't 14 recommendations for each, it was 14 across all 9. I'd kind of take that, and some of those are also them playing back to us what we've already told them. So where we've told them what the next steps need to be, some of that was them playing it back to us about making sure that you do certain things as well. So really good result, really good proactive engagement with them. So yeah, really good activity. In terms of the next steps for the programs moving forward, so some of the things that we identified in the safety justification, just to let the independent assessor, the system review panels, just to let them know that we're already thinking about this stuff, is the fact that we might want to start thinking about conducting intervention-specific significance assessments. It's been done as a program. Each of the interventions will probably be deemed significant as well, but it's worth documenting that moving forward, and we definitely need to start thinking about the stage works as well. So each of these interventions aren't going to be brought online in one big bang. There's going to be lots of stage works. Some of them might be deemed significant in their own right. So we need to think about that. Do some of these stage works need a safety assessment report in their own right moving forward? Because again, we need to build that into our programs. We need to make sure there's enough resource for the assessors, for the delivery teams. We need to think about that. Development of intervention-specific documentation. So I've mentioned that a few times. For the system definition, for the project authorization strategy and safety plans, there are already intervention-specific hazard records. So having their own suite of higher level planning documentation would make sense. So further development of NTSN compliance matrices, so these technical requirements. So making sure that we've sat down with the independent assessors, the approved body, the designated body, to get their buy-in, to get their agreement that the clauses that we've selected are in fact correct, that where we've said that we don't need to meet a particular clause for a certain reason, that they're in agreement with that. Again, no surprises later on down the line. Further development of safety requirements down to clause level, make sure that they're really specific, so it's really then obvious how we're going to be able to verify and validate that we've met those safety requirements later on. Some of them at the moment are probably a little bit too high level. More detailed hazard analysis and risk assessment work. So again, we've done a whole load of hazard work now, but we need to keep doing it as we go forward, as designs become more detailed, make sure what we've got is still relevant, that we've not missed anything. We've already talked about there are some derogations that we need to have to certain standards. So that would need to be backed up by risk assessment activities. There wasn't an awful lot of engagement with train and freight operators. There was some, but obviously that needs to pick up and get to be more detailed. Sorry, more detailed, more regular moving forward. Again, making sure that they're involved in all of the hazard identification activities, especially for the signalling interlocking activities, where some computer-based interlocking is going to be used for the first time in a particular area. The suppliers of those safety critical systems are going to be bringing with them their own specific application safety cases. They might have safety related application conditions that Network Rail will need to demonstrate that they've met. So again, that will need to be looked at to understand if it's still relevant. Sorry, not if it's still relevant, to demonstrate how those safety related application conditions are going to be met. So it's not something that people think an awful lot about sometimes. And what we wanted to start looking at as well was what impact the works we are doing could have on the existing entries in a national hazard directory. So we have something in the UK National Hazard Directory. It's got lots of hazards that need to be considered by maintenance and operations teams in various geographic locations. So we wanted to see, are we going to be impacting what's already in there that's been listed, but also what new hazards, residual risk items might we need to include into that hazard directory. Sorry, conscious of the time, I'm getting a bit carried away with it. So this is the last slide, and then let's see if there's some questions as well. So in terms of the one big thing I wanted to sort of leave you with, I never just leave it down to one thing. So there's three. So big thing, Network Rail realized that it was really, really important to embed safety assurance and these wider compliance activities from the outset of the program. Again, there are standards that sort of talk about it, but it's not always done really well. So they started really early on with strategic outline business case hazard identification work that we were then able to use and work with them to sort of progress. So doing things early was fantastic. We managed to use a lot of really good information that's already out in the big wide world to see how we can feed that into Midland Rail Hub. Really complex scheme, project, program, going to be really complex interventions, but again, nothing massively new and novel. So why not use some of this past information and past data to strengthen that sort of argument that we're not going to be missing anything. And there was some really great collaboration, not just from the independent assessors that I mentioned earlier, nor and the Network Rail project teams, but the designers really bought into the process too. You know, they're really engaged in the hazard identification workshops. They gave us their time when we need to start thinking about mitigation measures. And again, for those of you that have done that before, that can be really hard sometimes getting their buy-in, because they're there to design and they're there to design it safely. But again, these extra set of meetings that might not have been accounted for can sometimes lead to a bit of a clash. But they came to the party and they really helped to make sure that the process went smoothly. So yes, that's so a little bit over time. So apologies for that. I can obviously look to. I'm more than happy to take some questions. I think I saw that there is some that was popping up in the chat. We've got a whole load. We do free webinars as a bit of a regular thing. Some of you have come to some of these, so please do check on that link there to see if there's some free webinars that you want to come along to. We talk about each process really in the CSM lifecycle. We do offer a one-day training course about safety assurance against CSM regulations, so feel free to check that out if you wish. I would love it. You don't need to do it right now this second, but I'm going to put a link in the chat. I would absolutely love it if you could fill in a feedback form. That would be really, really appreciative, because not all of you have left yet, but hopefully you're not just doing it because you just want to be kind, right? So hopefully you're getting value of it. But if there's things that you think we need to improve, please do fill out that feedback form. There's like 5 questions and 4 of those are multiple choice. I think the other one might be an option to put your name in or something like that. So that would be great if you could do it. There's a link to the course if anyone's interested. Let me stop sharing my screen and I'll try and go back up to the top to see what some of the questions were. So did we consider the use of common hazards for management of industry safety? So SHAM or RSSB not used enough. Yes, yes, we did. I think Thomas might have had to have left as well, but yes. So through the use of some of these hazard checklists as well. So some of the checklists that I'll use from a safety assurance perspective. So like the system safety element of it, some of them are very applicable to the health and safety side of it. So we did consider some of those, and there are some entries that we've already marked up for transfer to more of the sort of CDM, construction design management sort of risk registers that will be deployed as well. I think that's the link to the research paper that came with the high level hazards. So that would be worth checking out for people that Thomas has kindly put into the chat. So that's really good. Couple more quick. Did you employ the use of bow ties to group hazards? So no, we've not deployed the use of bow ties. Some people do like to do that. It's not something that we produced. I think if, say, we're on this for the foreseeable, then it might be something we use for the really tricky stuff that might come up. But it's not something that we deployed so far. And to be honest, it's something that I've very rarely seen deployed on a lot of these types of projects. Did you combine CSM and CDM into one project hazard record? So no, we didn't on this occasion. We've marked up entries that we think are more construction related. We've marked them up for transfer into the CDM risk register. That was also under development. So no, we have kept things separate on here. If they were to be combined, again, it's a very similar process, right? Identifying hazards, figure out how we need to mitigate them, go and show me some evidence that you have mitigated it. Yeah, you just might need a different set of individuals involved in reviewing the entries that's in there. That would be my biggest takeaway. It's not going to be the same people that are sort of reviewing the same sort of entries all the time. Will there be individual project hazard records for each intervention? So yes, there already are. So the idea is that will be continued moving forward. Each of these sort of interventions are going to be delivered in different timelines, I guess, different stages. So they will be managed as a per intervention activity. But the idea is that if there's like some guide in mind at program level, that we can try and make sure that a lot of the information that goes into the intervention hazard records is very similar. As I mentioned earlier, we don't want to deal with one hazard in a completely different way in South West and Central, as opposed to how we do it in East Midlands. So hopefully there will still be some guide in mind to make sure that, you know, we can keep that consistency as we go across. That's one of the systems. Yeah. So cool. So yeah, Gary. I don't know if you've left or still there. No, Gary's still there. So Gary is awesome. And yeah, Network do a lot of free lunch and learns on a similar sort of theme. If you get any inquiries from Canada, Gary, I'll let you deal with that. But yeah, there's some lot of, like, been to some of them, delivered one right at the beginning. They're really good. They're really good. So if you do get to join them, I highly recommend it. Just go see between two standards that were required to comply with. So with the one about interoperability, right? So discrepancy between two standard specs that we're required to comply with. So from a interoperability perspective, so some of the information in the national technical specification notices, I can't think of examples right now, but they don't completely neatly align with with various options that might be drawn up in Network Rail company standards. So at that particular point in time, it might be that some of those are then having to be justified to the approved and designated bodies as to why we might not be meeting the NTSN and we might be meeting the company standard instead. So that would be part of like a derogation risk assessment type process. We hadn't. I'm just trying to think. We knew where there might need to be some derogations, but that wasn't between a conflict of standards. That was just more about we knew we weren't going to be able to meet a certain requirement when we were reintroducing a platform that hadn't been used for a while. So that's not something that's come up as of yet, I'm afraid. So it's not something that I've got a good example for. So apologies for that, but hopefully I was able to answer the other sort of questions. Okay. Are there any other sort of questions that? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Fair point, Gary. Yeah, and we experienced that with some of the taxi rank work that we were doing just on Euston Station for HS2. So yeah, that's that can be an interesting one. Absolutely. So is there any other sort of questions at all that if anyone wants to come off mic, happy to answer it, but I realize that we're already over time, and some of you might have another meeting coming up if you're in Canada, and some of you just might want to go home if you're in the UK. So okay, cool. Right, we'll leave it there then. Thanks very much, everyone. Really appreciate it. We'll drop you a note when the recording's ready, and everything like that, and where you can access the slides and everything. So really appreciate you taking the time out of your day, and yeah, looking forward to catching up with you again soon. Thanks very much. Bye.